In the middle of the Vietnam War, when American troop numbers in the country had already passed 500,000, a much smaller ally quietly arrived with a very different idea about how the war should be fought. Australia was not sending massive divisions, fleets of helicopters, or thousands of artillery pieces. Instead, it brought something far less visible, but potentially far more dangerous to the enemy: patience, discipline, and a strategy built on small unit warfare. Australia's involvement in Vietnam did not begin with a dramatic declaration. In the early 1960s, the government in Canberra watched events in Southeast Asia with growing concern. The Cold War had turned the region into a strategic chessboard. Communist victories in China in 1949 and later in North Vietnam had already reshaped the balance of power. Many Western leaders believed in what they called the domino theory. The idea was simple but alarming. If one country in Southeast Asia fell to communism, others might soon follow. For Australia, a country geographically closer to Asia than Europe or North America, the stakes felt particularly high. By 1962, Australia had already begun sending military advisors to South Vietnam. These men were part of the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, a small but elite group tasked with helping South Vietnamese forces fight the growing insurgency of the Viet Cong. The advisors worked closely with local troops, often in remote and dangerous areas. Their reports back to Australia painted a complicated picture. The war was not a conventional conflict between large armies. It was a shadow war fought in jungles, villages, and rice paddies. The enemy did not always wear uniforms, and the battlefield had no clear front lines. As the conflict intensified in the mid-1960s, the United States dramatically expanded its presence in Vietnam. American troops began arriving in enormous numbers. Entire divisions were deployed, supported by helicopters, jet aircraft, and heavy artillery. Large search and destroy operations became the dominant American strategy. These missions were designed to locate enemy forces, engage them with overwhelming firepower, and destroy them. However, Australia was cautious about simply copying this approach. In 1966, the Australian government made a major decision. Instead of sending small detachments scattered among American units, Australia would deploy a full, independent formation. This force became known as the 1st Australian Task Force, often shortened to 1ATF. It was not huge by American standards, usually around 4,500 troops, but it was carefully organized. It included infantry battalions, artillery units, engineers, armored vehicles, and specialized reconnaissance patrols. Most importantly, it would operate as a cohesive force under Australian command. The task force needed its own area of responsibility, a place where it could apply its methods without constantly being absorbed into American operations. That place was Phuoc Tuy Province. On the map, Phuoc Tuy did not look particularly dramatic. Located southeast of Saigon, it was a dense jungle, rubber plantations, scattered villages, and narrow dirt roads. But its location made it strategically important. It lay along key infiltration routes used by the Viet Cong, and it provided access to the sea. Control of this province meant controlling an important corridor for enemy movement. When Australian troops first examined the province in detail, they realized something else. Phuoc Tuy was almost entirely dominated by the Viet Cong. Many of the villages had been infiltrated by guerrilla networks. Local officials were intimidated or secretly cooperating with insurgents. In some areas, the Viet Cong moved freely at night, collecting food, intelligence, and recruits. By day, the same villages might appear calm and loyal to the South Vietnamese government. It was exactly the kind of environment where guerrilla warfare thrived. American commanders had already conducted operations in and around the province, but the results were often temporary. Large American sweeps would push through an area, engage enemy units, and then withdraw. Once the troops left, Viet Cong fighters frequently returned. Australian planners believed the problem required a different approach. Many Australian officers had studied counter-insurgency warfare in places like Malaya, where British and Commonwealth forces had fought a long campaign against communist guerrillas in the 1950s. That conflict had taught them that defeating an insurgency was not simply about killing enemy fighters. It required controlling territory, protecting villages, and slowly dismantling the underground networks that supported the guerrillas. Instead of massive search and destroy missions, the Australians favored smaller patrols, moving quietly through the jungle. These patrols would observe, track, and ambush enemy units rather than announcing their presence with overwhelming firepower. The goal was not just to fight the enemy, but to make it increasingly difficult for the enemy to operate. This doctrine placed enormous emphasis on discipline and cohesion. Australian infantry units trained to move silently for days through thick jungle. Soldiers learned to read subtle signs on the ground, broken branches, faint footprints, disturbed leaves. A small patrol might follow a trail for hours or even days before setting up an ambush at exactly the right moment. Success depended on teamwork and trust between soldiers who had trained together for months. This philosophy also shaped how the Australians organized their base of operations. In 1966, the 1st Australian Task Force established its main base at Nui Dat, right in the middle of Phuoc Tuy. It was a bold decision. Instead of operating from distant coastal bases, the Australians placed themselves directly inside the contested area. From Nui Dat, patrols could move quickly into surrounding jungle and villages. The base itself soon became a heavily fortified position, protected by artillery, armored vehicles, and defensive minefields. But beyond those defenses stretched miles of dense vegetation where Australian patrols operated almost constantly. For the soldiers arriving in Vietnam, the environment was overwhelming. The jungle was thick, humid, and often claustrophobic. Temperatures regularly climbed above 30 degrees Celsius, and the air felt heavy enough to drink. Leeches clung to boots and uniforms. Mosquitoes carried disease. Rainstorms could transform dirt tracks into rivers of mud within minutes. And somewhere out there in the jungle, often invisible, were the Viet Cong. They knew the terrain intimately. Many had grown up in the villages scattered across the province. They used hidden bunkers, tunnel systems, and carefully concealed supply caches. By day, the same villages might appear calm and loyal to the South Vietnamese government. It was exactly the kind of environment where guerrilla warfare thrived. But there was another challenge looming large, one that had less to do with the Viet Cong and more with their powerful ally. The American military was enormous, confident, and committed to its own methods of fighting the war. American commanders were accustomed to integrating Allied units into their operational system, sharing manpower and resources across formations. For a small force like the 1st Australian Task Force, that posed a serious question. Could a relatively small Allied contingent maintain its own distinct strategy inside a war increasingly dominated by American scale and firepower? At first, the issue remained mostly theoretical. The Australians focused on building their base, learning the terrain, and beginning their patrol operations across Phuoc Tuy. But behind the scenes, discussions were already beginning between Allied commanders. Those discussions would eventually lead to one of the most blunt and controversial moments of cooperation in the entire Vietnam War, when an Australian commander looked across the table at American generals and made it clear that his force would fight the war its own way.
At first glance, the alliance between Australia and the United States in Vietnam looked perfectly natural. Both countries were fighting on the same side of the Cold War. Both were determined to prevent South Vietnam from falling to communist forces. And both armies shared a long history of cooperation, stretching back through World War II and the Korean War. On paper, their partnership in Vietnam seemed inevitable. But once the war intensified, it quickly became clear that the two allies were approaching the battlefield in very different ways. By the mid-1960s, The United States had committed an enormous military presence to Vietnam. Hundreds of thousands of American soldiers, Marines, and airmen were deployed across the country. Entire divisions operated from massive bases, supported by fleets of helicopters, jet aircraft, heavy artillery, and armored vehicles. American commanders believed that the key to victory was finding the enemy's main forces and destroying them with overwhelming firepower. This strategy became known as search and destroy. The concept was straightforward. Large formations of troops would sweep through suspected enemy areas, using helicopters to insert soldiers deep into the jungle. Once contact was made with Viet Cong or North Vietnamese units, artillery and air power would be called in to crush them. The goal was to inflict such heavy casualties that the enemy could no longer continue the war. American forces had the resources to execute these operations on an enormous scale. A single mission could involve thousands of soldiers, dozens of helicopters, and waves of fighter jets circling overhead. Entire valleys or jungle regions might be bombarded before troops even landed. But there was a problem. The Viet Cong rarely fought the kind of battles the Americans were looking for. Instead of standing their ground against massive firepower, guerrilla units usually melted away before large operations arrived. They used hidden trails, tunnels, and local knowledge to disappear into the jungle. By the time American troops reached an area, the enemy might already be gone. And when the operation ended and the troops withdrew, the guerrillas often returned. Australian commanders watched this pattern carefully. Many of them had studied or even participated in earlier counter-insurgency campaigns, especially the long British struggle against communist guerrillas in Malaya during the 1950s. That war had taught some hard lessons about how insurgencies survive. Guerrilla movements rarely depended on large armies alone. They relied on networks of local support, villagers who provided food, information, and safe hiding places. Without that support, insurgent fighters would struggle to survive. With it, they could disappear almost indefinitely. For Australian officers, this meant that simply hunting enemy units in the jungle was not enough. The real battle was about control. Control of villages, roads, farmland, and the loyalty of the local population. If government forces could make villages safe and deny guerrillas access to supplies and recruits, the insurgency would slowly weaken. That philosophy shaped how the first Australian task force began operating in Phuoc Tuy Province. Instead of launching enormous sweeps across the region, Australian units focused on smaller, more methodical patrols. Infantry sections moved quietly through the jungle, often in groups small enough to avoid detection. Their goal was not to announce their presence, but to observe the enemy, track his movements, and strike at the right moment. Patrols sometimes lasted several days at a time. Soldiers carried everything they needed on their backs: food, water, ammunition, radios, and medical supplies. They walked slowly, carefully, often stopping for long periods to listen for movement in the surrounding vegetation. The jungle itself became part of the battlefield. Every broken branch, every footprint in the mud, every piece of disturbed vegetation could tell a story. Experienced soldiers learned to read these clues the way hunters read tracks. A single cigarette butt on a trail might reveal that a guerrilla unit had passed through only hours earlier. When patrols confirmed enemy movement, they often prepared ambushes rather than direct attacks. Ambush warfare demanded patience. Soldiers would position themselves silently along a trail and wait, sometimes for hours, sometimes for an entire night. When the moment came, the attack would be sudden and devastating, lasting only seconds before the patrol disappeared back into the jungle.
This approach required a high level of discipline and trust among the troops. Every soldier needed to understand the plan perfectly. Noise had to be minimized. Communication often relied on hand signals rather than spoken words. A single mistake, an accidental sound, a visible movement could reveal the entire position. Because of this, Australian commanders believed strongly in keeping their units intact. Soldiers trained together for months before deployment, learning each other's habits, strengths, and reactions. Patrol success often depended on instinctive cooperation between men who knew exactly how their teammates would respond in dangerous situations. Mixing unfamiliar troops into these patrols could be risky. Meanwhile, American operations in nearby areas continued on a much larger scale. Helicopter formations roared across the sky, artillery thundered from distant bases, massive troop movements pushed through jungle regions searching for enemy battalions. Sometimes the two approaches overlapped. American commanders occasionally conducted large operations near Phuoc Tuy, hoping to trap enemy forces moving through the region. These missions brought enormous firepower into the area, but they also had side effects. The noise and destruction often drove guerrilla fighters deeper into hiding or pushed them into neighboring provinces. For the Australians working patiently to track smaller Viet Cong units, these disruptions could complicate their efforts. Still, cooperation between the Allies remained essential. Intelligence was shared, air support was available if Australian patrols found themselves in serious danger, and American logistics helped sustain Allied forces across South Vietnam. Yet beneath the surface, differences in philosophy continued to grow. American commanders believed that victory required aggressive operations and heavy enemy casualties. Australian officers believed that the war would ultimately be decided by who controlled the countryside and the population living there. Neither side saw itself as wrong. Both were trying to solve an extremely difficult problem in a complex and unfamiliar environment. But the contrast between their strategies was becoming impossible to ignore. Inside Phuoc Tuy Province, the Australians continued refining their methodical approach. Patrols mapped hidden trails, intelligence officers built networks of local information. Gradually, piece by piece, they tried to understand how the Viet Cong operated within the province. It was slow, frustrating work. Progress could take months, but Australian commanders believed that once their system was fully established, it would begin to squeeze the guerrilla network in ways large operations never could. What they did not yet realize was that a different challenge was about to emerge, one that had nothing to do with Viet Cong tactics or jungle warfare. It would come from their own allies, and it would force an Australian brigadier to make a decision that stunned American commanders and defined the independence of the entire Australian task force in Vietnam.
By 1966, the war in Vietnam had reached a scale few had imagined only a few years earlier. American troop numbers had exploded, massive bases stretched across the countryside, and new units arrived almost every week. The United States military machine was operating at full speed, constantly moving men, equipment, and supplies into the conflict. In that enormous system, manpower was everything. American divisions rotated soldiers frequently. Replacements arrived to fill gaps caused by casualties, illness, or the simple expiration of a soldier's tour of duty. Fresh troops were constantly being inserted into units already in combat. It was an unavoidable reality of such a large war. But the Australian task force operating in Phuoc Tuy Province was built very differently. The 1st Australian Task Force depended heavily on unit cohesion. Infantry battalions trained together long before they ever arrived in Vietnam. Patrol techniques, silent movement through the jungle, and ambush tactics required precise coordination. Soldiers had to trust each other completely. In the dense jungle, one man's mistake could endanger the entire patrol. Because of this, Australian commanders were extremely cautious about introducing unfamiliar soldiers into their units. For the Americans, however, the idea of sharing manpower between Allied forces seemed practical. The United States had far more troops available in Vietnam than any of its partners. If certain Allied units were short on manpower or needed reinforcements, American personnel could theoretically fill those roles. At some point during discussions between Allied commanders, the idea surfaced that American soldiers might be assigned to serve alongside Australian units in Phuoc Tuy. On the surface, the suggestion sounded reasonable. Both armies were fighting the same enemy, both were trained professionals. Integrating troops from different Allied nations was not unusual in large coalition wars. But for the Australians, the proposal immediately raised serious concerns. The 1st Australian Task Force was already operating in one of the most difficult environments in Vietnam. Patrols moved silently through thick jungle, where visibility could be less than 20 meters. Engagements with the Viet Cong often occurred suddenly and at extremely close range. There was no time for confusion, hesitation, or unfamiliarity with procedures. Australian officers believed that every soldier in those patrols needed to understand their tactics instinctively. There was another issue as well, one that many commanders preferred not to discuss openly. The training systems of the two armies were not identical. Australian troops arriving in Vietnam had already undergone specialized jungle warfare training. They had spent months preparing for the exact conditions they would face in Phuoc Tuy. American soldiers were brave and capable, but they came from a much larger military system with different operational priorities. Many arrived in Vietnam with limited jungle experience before being assigned directly to combat units. For Australian leaders, simply inserting unfamiliar replacements, no matter how skilled, could disrupt the delicate system they had built. Eventually, the issue reached a formal meeting between Australian and American commanders. The room likely contained experienced officers from both nations, men who had spent their careers in uniform and who understood the importance of cooperation between allies. But this particular conversation was about to become unusually direct. The Australian commander of the task force listened as the proposal was discussed. American representatives explained that additional manpower could be made available if needed. With so many troops in Vietnam, it seemed logical that some could support Allied operations. Then came the response. The Australian brigadier did not deliver a long diplomatic explanation. Instead, according to several accounts that circulated later among soldiers and historians, his answer was blunt enough to leave the room momentarily silent. He essentially told the Americans not to send their replacements to serve with his troops. In even more colorful retellings, the phrase used was far sharper: "Don't send us your rejects." Whether those exact words were spoken or whether they were a simplified version repeated later, the meaning was unmistakable. The Australian commander was refusing the offer. It was a striking moment. In a war dominated by American power, a much smaller Allied force was openly rejecting additional manpower from the United States military. To American officers, the statement may have sounded surprising, even insulting at first. The United States was carrying the overwhelming burden of the war. Its troops were fighting and dying across the country in huge numbers. But the brigadier's refusal was not meant as an attack on American soldiers. His concern was about maintaining the integrity of his force. The Australian task force had been designed to operate as a tightly coordinated system. Its patrol techniques, communication methods, and command structure all depended on soldiers who had trained together and understood the doctrine completely. Introducing unfamiliar replacements, especially soldiers who had not trained within that system, could create dangerous gaps in coordination. And in the jungle, those gaps could be deadly. The brigadier believed that if his units were short on manpower, the solution was not to patch them with outsiders, but to rotate entire Australian units in and out of Vietnam as intact formations. That way, each battalion would maintain its internal cohesion. The meeting ended with the Australian position clear. The 1st Australian Task Force would continue operating in Phuoc Tuy Province under its own command structure, using its own tactics, and relying on its own soldiers. It was a rare moment of strategic independence inside a war that was otherwise heavily shaped by American decisions. Yet the real test of that decision was still ahead. Words spoken in a meeting room meant little compared to the reality of combat. If the Australian approach was going to justify such confidence, it would have to prove itself in the jungles of Phuoc Tuy.
By late 1966, the 1st Australian Task Force had settled into its base at Nui Dat, and the true test of its strategy had begun. The Australians were now fully responsible for security across Phuoc Tuy Province, a region that had long been considered one of the Viet Cong's safest strongholds. The decision to operate independently was no longer just a matter of doctrine or pride, it was about survival. From Nui Dat, patrols began spreading outward in every direction. Unlike the massive American operations happening elsewhere in Vietnam, Australian movements were often small and deliberate. A patrol might consist of only 6 or 8 men, moving quietly through the jungle. Their objective was rarely to search large areas quickly. Instead, they tried to understand the rhythm of the province, the trails used by guerrilla couriers, the paths connecting hidden supply caches, the routes fighters took when moving between villages. The work was slow and exhausting. Days could pass with nothing but the sounds of insects, wind, and distant wildlife. Soldiers walked for hours beneath the thick jungle canopy, where sunlight barely reached the ground. Sweat soaked through uniforms within minutes. Leeches clung to boots and legs. Every step had to be taken carefully because the Viet Cong were masters of traps. Improvised mines, hidden spikes, and tripwire grenades were common. A careless patrol could stumble directly into them. Yet the Australians believed that patience would eventually turn the jungle itself into an ally. The more patrols they sent out, the more they learned about the invisible network connecting Viet Cong units across the province. Gradually, patterns began to appear. Certain trails were used repeatedly. Certain villages quietly supported the insurgents. Certain jungle areas contained hidden bunker systems where fighters could disappear when larger operations approached. Instead of attacking these locations with overwhelming firepower, Australian commanders often chose a quieter approach. If a patrol discovered an enemy trail, they might not destroy it immediately. Instead, they would observe it, sometimes for days, watching to see who used it and when. Once they understood the movement patterns, they could plan ambushes with far greater precision. Ambush warfare became one of the defining features of Australian operations in Phuoc Tuy. A typical ambush required careful preparation. Soldiers would position themselves along a trail where enemy movement was expected. They concealed themselves beneath vegetation, camouflaged so well that even a careful observer might walk past without noticing them. Then they waited. Waiting could last hours. Sometimes the jungle remained silent. Other times, faint sounds would begin to emerge, footsteps on dry leaves, quiet voices, the metallic clink at equipment. In those moments, every soldier remained perfectly still, finger resting lightly on the trigger. When the enemy entered the killing zone, the ambush would erupt in a sudden burst of gunfire and grenades. The attack lasted only seconds, sometimes less than a minute. Then the patrol would disappear again before larger enemy forces could react. These small, sharp engagements slowly began to wear down the Viet Cong presence in the province. But the Australians were also forced to face moments of intense danger. The most famous example came in August 1966, during one of the earliest major battles fought by the task force. A company of Australian soldiers from the 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, had been conducting patrols east of Nui Dat when they encountered a much larger enemy force moving through a rubber plantation near the village of Long Tan. At first, the Australians believed they had encountered only a small group of guerrillas, but as the firefight developed, it became clear they were facing a force many times their size, likely a full Viet Cong regiment supported by additional units. Heavy rain began to fall, turning the plantation floor into thick mud. Visibility dropped as sheets of water poured through the trees. The Australians found themselves surrounded by hundreds of enemy fighters advancing through the plantation. For several hours, the small company fought desperately to hold its position. Artillery from Nui Dat thundered across the battlefield, landing dangerously close to the Australian lines but breaking up enemy assaults. Ammunition began running low. At times, the fighting occurred at distances of less than 50 meters. Despite the overwhelming numbers against them, the Australian soldiers held their ground until armored vehicles and reinforcements finally arrived. When the battle ended, the results shocked many observers. The Australian company had suffered casualties, but the Viet Cong losses were far heavier. The engagement became known as the Battle of Long Tan, and it demonstrated both the risks and strengths of the Australian approach. The soldiers had survived not because of overwhelming numbers, but because of discipline, coordination, and effective artillery support. For the commanders of the 1st Australian Task Force, the battle reinforced their belief that cohesive units trained in their own doctrine could hold their own even under extreme pressure. After Long Tan, Australian operations in Phuoc Tuy continued with renewed confidence. Patrols expanded deeper into the province. Engineers worked to disrupt enemy supply routes. Intelligence teams built stronger relationships with local communities, trying to separate villagers from the influence of the Viet Cong. Little by little, the invisible network that had once dominated the province began to weaken. It was not a quick victory. Guerrilla warfare rarely produced dramatic turning points. Instead, progress came through hundreds of small patrols, dozens of ambushes, and countless hours of quiet observation. But the most important result was becoming clear. The Australian task force had proven that its doctrine could function independently. The decision to maintain a cohesive force trained in a specific style of jungle warfare had allowed them to operate effectively in one of the most contested provinces in South Vietnam. And that meant the brigadier's controversial refusal months earlier was no longer just a bold statement. It had become a strategy that worked.
As the war in Vietnam dragged into the late 1960s and early 1970s, the situation across the country grew more complicated. American troop numbers eventually reached their peak, massive operations continued across multiple provinces, and the conflict increasingly dominated global headlines. Yet inside Phuoc Tuy Province, the war often looked very different from the dramatic images seen on television. For the 1st Australian Task Force, the campaign had become a long, grinding effort built on consistency rather than spectacle. From their base at Nui Dat, Australian units continued their pattern of patrols, ambushes, and village security operations. The goal remained the same as it had been from the beginning: deny the Viet Cong freedom of movement, weaken their underground networks, and slowly extend government control over the countryside. It was not a strategy designed to produce sudden victories. Instead, it focused on reducing the enemy's ability to operate. When patrols repeatedly appeared on the same jungle trails, guerrilla fighters were forced to move farther and take greater risks. When villages were protected more effectively, local support for insurgents became harder to maintain. Over time, these pressures could disrupt the structure that allowed guerrilla warfare to survive. Phuoc Tuy Province gradually became one of the areas where Allied forces had a more stable presence. This did not mean the fighting stopped. Ambushes, mines, and sudden firefights remained constant dangers for Australian soldiers. The Viet Cong were still capable of launching attacks and moving supplies through the jungle. But compared with some other provinces in South Vietnam, the insurgent network in Phuoc Tuy found it increasingly difficult to operate openly. For the Australians serving there, daily life followed a relentless rhythm. Patrols left Nui Dat before dawn and vanished into the jungle for days at a time. Soldiers carried heavy packs filled with ammunition, rations, water, and radio equipment. They slept in shallow defensive positions dug into the ground, often waking several times during the night to stand watch. When patrols returned to the base, they cleaned weapons, reported intelligence, and prepared to go out again. The work was physically exhausting and mentally demanding. Weeks could pass with little visible progress, yet every patrol added a small piece to the larger picture of how the enemy operated in the province. Over time, the Australian presence became firmly established. Entire battalions rotated through Phuoc Tuy, but they always arrived as complete units that had trained together beforehand. This system preserved the cohesion that Australian commanders considered essential. Each incoming battalion learned from the experience of the one before it, gradually improving tactics and understanding of the local terrain. The independence of the task force also remained intact. Although American forces operated throughout South Vietnam and provided vital support such as air power and logistics, the Australians largely maintained control over how operations were conducted inside their province. Their patrol-based strategy continued without being absorbed into the large-scale search and destroy operations common elsewhere. Looking back years later, historians would often highlight this difference. Some argued that the Australian method reflected lessons from earlier counter-insurgency wars and showed how smaller forces could adapt to guerrilla conflicts. Others noted that the scale of Phuoc Tuy was limited compared with the vast areas American forces were responsible for controlling. What worked in one province might not have worked across the entire country. But one point remained clear. The decision to keep the Australian force cohesive and independent had shaped everything that followed. That moment when the brigadier refused the idea of outside replacements was more than a dramatic exchange between Allied commanders. It was a declaration that the Australians intended to fight the war in their own way, using a doctrine built around patience, discipline, and small unit operations. For the soldiers who served in Phuoc Tuy, that doctrine defined their entire experience of Vietnam. They were not part of massive helicopter assaults involving thousands of troops. More often, they were a handful of men moving silently through dense jungle, listening for the faintest sound of movement in the darkness. Their war was quiet, tense, and often invisible. When Australia eventually began withdrawing its forces from Vietnam in the early 1970s, the men of the 1st Australian Task Force left behind a record of operations that had been very different from many other Allied campaigns. They had spent years fighting a patient and methodical war in a single province, trying to limit the influence of a determined insurgency. The conflict in Vietnam would ultimately end in a way that few of the soldiers who fought there could control. Political decisions far from the jungle battlefields would shape the final outcome. Yet the story of the Australians in Phuoc Tuy remains a remarkable example of how Allied forces sometimes fought the same war with entirely different philosophies. And at the center of that story stands a moment of defiance inside a meeting room when an Australian commander made it clear that his men would not simply become another small piece of a much larger machine. They would fight the war their own way.